É com muito gosto que aqui vos temos também nesta nossa sessão. Vamos dar agora a plena atenção e o palco principal ao nosso orador principal desta nossa conferência. Convidámos o professor Jonh Volmink para ser o nosso keynote speaker, porque tem tudo de Ubuntu. É um homem sábio, é um homem que na sua vida viveu intensamente este desafio de construir pontes, de saber perdoar, de nunca esquecer a luta pela justiça, através da educação, por exemplo, um dos campos onde o professor Jonh Volmink mais teve intervenção, de saber também ele próprio perdoar na sua experiência pessoal e familiar as consequências do apartheid e do impacto duríssimo que teve na sua família. E foi para nós sempre um enorme inspirador. E por isso quisemos marcar o início desta jornada, para além das palavras da senhora embaixadora e da senhora engenheira Luísa Val, pela presença do professor Jonh Volmink e pela inspiração do professor Jonh Volmink. Ao longo do dia vamos ter os projetos que vão sendo apresentados e posso-vos garantir que são projetos fantásticos. Os projetos que aqui estão presentes e que tivemos a ocasião de conhecer são notáveis e teremos com certeza uma excelente conferência, nomeadamente da parte da tarde, onde os poderemos ouvir todos eles. Mas para que tudo isto tenha sentido é preciso perceber o que nos move a todos. E melhor que ninguém, o professor Jonh Volmink pode dar-nos esse enquadramento. Welcome, Professor Jonh Volmink. It's a great honor to have your presence here.
Thank you very much, Rui, and Ambassador as well, and ladies and gentlemen, honored guests. I want to say that it's a great honor, obviously, for me to be here. It's a great honor to reunite with not only Rui, but another Rui, and also the first generation of Ubuntu people. They are all here. They sowed across the audience, and they came to South Africa recently. I want to say that two things. One is to Gulbenkian Foundation. I want to say, Rui Machas is a man with a dream, and I like that about him. And that's the first thing I could see about him. He's a man with a dream, and it's important to have a dream. But it is not sufficient to have a dream, because some people die with their dream. And the only way to empower your dream is to work in partnership with others that share your dream. And for that reason, I want to acknowledge the Gulbenkian Foundation and also other partners in the audience who has made this dream possible. And what I see here in this audience is a dream come true. It's wonderful to see, not only in Portugal, not only in South Africa, but all over the world, including Russia. There are people from Russia here that now have a light burning in the name of Ubuntu. So thank you very much. To the ambassador, I want to say thank you very much for that inspiring speech. I want you to particularly know how grateful I am that you had pointed out the issue of poverty. And dealing with those that have been most excluded. I sat down with my two sons. I have many children. I won't tell you how many, but some of you know. Here's one here. and my children, my two older sons, they live in Johannesburg, and they live in a very nice area. And so the one is a medical doctor, the other one worked for JP Morgan. So they're sitting at a restaurant with me, and they asked me, the one at JP Morgan, of course, had left, and he's now a movie producer. He makes his own movies. And they said, Dad, what must we do? We really want to make a difference in this world. And I said to them, well, there is no formula. There's only a perspective. And of all the things that you could possibly do, the one thing you have to do if you want to make a difference in this world is to have a commitment to non-elitism. You cannot be an elitist and make a difference in this world. I'm not saying it's wrong to be an elitist, but if you really want to make a difference in this world, you have to have a worldview that embraces all, that embraces those that are advantaged, and as Ambassador said, also embrace those that have been traditionally excluded, the poorest of the poor. It's very important. Without that, you won't have an impact on the world. I want to say to Ambassador that, you know, she's mentioned several names of people that worked with Nelson Mandela, Joe Matthews being one. And Joe Matthews is the father of Ambassador. And so the South African ambassador here comes from very deep struggle roots. I worked with her sister, and I will talk about that in a minute, but who was the Minister of Education during the past decades. And he made a huge impact on South Africa. I've been asked to speak about, and I call it some thoughts on the philosophy of Ubuntu, and I won't speak very long. The first thing I want to say is that the world faces a number of global crises, even as we sit here. And some of these challenges are chronic. They stay with us, such as climate change and HIV and AIDS, chronic problems. Others are immediate, such as the financial crisis. And may I add the disappearance of MH370 tragically. The reason why I mention this is that these crises and challenges do not respect national boundaries. They do not respect regional boundaries. They are oblivious to these things. And they call us for unprecedented levels of global cooperation. You will see with MH370. But the real question for me is, within this global, dealing with these global challenges and global crises and global cooperation, the real question for me is whether these forms of global cooperation would lead to more humane redirections of globalization that is informed by a new global ethic? Or will it simply entrench constructs of neoliberalism and unbridled cultural arrogance, which I see too much of? We would like to believe, and the ambassador has spoken about this, that one contributor to a genuine emergence of a new global ethic is the African concept of Ubuntu. Given its fundamental relational nature, it can be argued that Ubuntu crosses all boundaries, like our challenges crosses all boundaries. Boundaries of politics, boundaries of economics, of culture, of civil society. And hence, it has the potential to influence the spheres of public policy, of citizenship, of development, of governance. Whether one sees Ubuntu, you can see Ubuntu in classical terms as a moral philosophy, or in the language of postmodernity, you could see Ubuntu as a meta-narrative. The fundamental tenet is found in the simple Zulu expression, umuntu, ngumuntu, ngabantu, which is loosely translated. I am because you are, and you are because we are. Both ways. This concept, I must say, boggles the Cartesian mind. When René Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. And you're in that mode, which again, this is not a criticism. It's just another way of looking at the world. The Cartesian mind is boggled because this concept of individuality now has to shift from solitary to solidarity, from independence as an individual to interdependence. It's a big shift. From individuality distinct from the community to individuality within the community. The question arises again as to whether this worldview can influence the meta-narrative. Can Ubuntu really influence the world? Or whether maybe it's just a small narrative influencing only its immediate locality and context. If we just reflect on that for a minute, it is clear that the philosophy of Ubuntu finds its antecedents in a broad ethic that has deep historical roots and is vast in extent and extends beyond Africa. Think for a moment of the ancient ideal captured in the Sanskrit term ahimsa, which means do not injure, do not harm, which provides a philosophical underpinning for nonviolence. Or even the term coined by Mahatma Gandhi, who lived in South Africa 20 years, Satyagraha, loosely translated as insistence on truth, or truth force, or soul force, which provides a basis for nonviolent resistance. And that nonviolent resistance, the philosophy of nonviolent resistance, is the one that influenced both Martin Luther King Jr. as well as Nelson Mandela. There's also the Judeo-Christian ethic, the social justice ethic, contained in Imago Dei, which asserts that human beings are created in God's image and therefore have inherent value, independent of their utility or their function. All of these and others that I can go on and speak about lead one to see that there is an immense philosophical ocean influencing the meta-narrative, and that from this ocean, Ubuntu is but one stream. Secondly, far from advocating for Ubuntu as some type of socio-political panacea, there are many voices that are directing us away from cultural particularism towards a far broader humanism, a universalism. One of those is Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And he talks about Ubuntu as the essence of being human. Not being South African, not being Portuguese, but being human. The essence of being human is Ubuntu. Now, whether we realize it or not, we have a shared identity with others. And the concept of Ubuntu is saying a person has a proper self-assurance that comes from knowing that he or she belongs in a greater whole and is diminished when others are humiliated. And when others are tortured or oppressed. Nelson Mandela, in his book, The Long Walk to Freedom, puts it differently. And I quote, "I have always known," says Nelson Mandela, "that deep down in every human heart, there is a mercy and a generosity. No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin, his background, or religion. People must learn to hate And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. Even at the grimmest times in prison, he says, when my comrades and I were pushed to our limits, I would see a glimmer of humanity in one of the guards. Perhaps just for a second. But it was enough to reassure me and keep me going. And he ends by saying, man's goodness is a flame that can be hidden but never extinguished. And through these voices, Ubuntu is again moving us away. The voice of Tutu, the voice of Madiba, is moving us away from cultural particularism towards a broader humanism or universalism. They are not the only voices, but they are important voices. Nelson Mandela had made a huge impact, undeniably, on the meta-narrative in the world. And in my view, he contributed greatly to a more humane globalization informed by a global ethic. It is this ethic that we need as we grapple with challenges that transcend national boundaries and calls for global cooperation today. I just want to say it was the spirit of Ubuntu that made us as South Africans, was at the heart of the decision in South Africa to go the truth and reconciliation route. It wasn't necessary, but it was important. It was the spirit of Ubuntu, and I quote Desmond Tutu when he says, in the spirit of Ubuntu, the central concern is the healing of breaches, the redressing of imbalances, the restoration of broken relationships, and a search to rehabilitate both the victim and the perpetrator, who should be given the opportunity to be reintegrated into the community that he has injured by his offense. That's very unique to South Africa. I don't think any other country in the world has done that. That is a uniquely South African contribution to the meta-narrative. In this context, one idea within the global citizenship discourse that warrants, in my view, further interrogation is that of the idea of cosmopolitanism. That is the idea that all human beings, regardless of their political affiliation, regardless of their origin, regardless of their nationality, can belong to a single community, and that this community should be cultivated. And I have to congratulate here again the work that I see in this country, and our audience here bears testimony to it. Ubuntu provides a moral orientation for this debate. Lastly, in this section, within the broader discussion of the meta-narrative, is the human rights discourse, which is another discourse. It's not only the global citizenship discourse that has been influenced by Ubuntu, but also the human rights discourse in the world. It has been argued that the spirit of Ubuntu provides a connection between indigenous value systems and universal human rights embodied in international law. It is furthermore argued by some that the values enshrined in Ubuntu could possibly be incorporated into a reformulated version of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And there are some people that are working seriously towards that end. But let us just return for a minute to what I call the small narrative, the South African narrative. And I have to say there, because if ever there was a system that was diametrically opposite to the spirit of Ubuntu, then it was that of apartheid South Africa. My own journey towards Ubuntu has its genesis in the experience of growing up in a system that celebrated and enforced separatism, one that constantly assaulted my dignity and my humanity, and one that drew a sharp distinction between the few and the many as a fundamental mode of social organization. A system in which there is a segment who believed as many across the world still believe today, that in the name of ideology, in the name of belief, in the name of self-defense, one human being has the right to injure or even kill another. It is this system that made me leave South Africa and find perspective elsewhere. And I have to say, just if you allow me just a personal diversion. In 1976 was a difficult year in South Africa. 1976, the young people rose up in revolt against the system. 1976, I was married for 1 year. My wife and I, one day just before Christmas, had been on our way to some function. And prior to that, during the year, given the unrest in South Africa, I had left my studies and went to teach in a township during the height of the riots and was almost killed, but I won't go into that detail. And then after that, in between this event and that event in the township, my wife's parents called that she and I should come out to where they live, which is about 100 miles away from Cape Town. When I got there were police all over, and there was a bulldozer. And the police said to Angela, my wife's parents, "You've got 5 minutes to get out of this house." This is a house in a place called Stanford. And Stanford was a slave master. And slavery was abolished in South Africa in 1834. So everybody that lived in Stanford had the right to live. So black and white, everybody lived there, including my wife, grew up there. 150 years. And now apartheid has reached its tentacles to Stanford. And I arrived there at the moment when the police had already decided there's no more negotiation, 5 minutes. My in-laws had refused to move, and the next thing I saw was some of the police take off some of the doors that they liked, and some are going inside, I don't know what they took. And then the bulldozer came. And while the whole family was standing, they bulldozed down the house. And gave my father-in-law a fine for not wanting to move. His house was flat. Piano, everything, beds, everything. Then comes this event. 2 months later, just before Christmas, I go to a function. My sister asked me to arrange a ride for her, and I arranged a ride to the same function with an American friend who happened to be white. Unfortunately, on their way there, they met with an accident. Some person under the influence of liquor had gone head-on into them. And by the time I got to the scene, I could see the driver, who was my friend, Margaret, pinned under the steering column. She could not move. My sister was lying next to her, bleeding profusely. And I realized that I need to take my sister to the hospital. And at that moment, while I was still trying to figure this out, a face appeared on the driver's side. And it was the face of an ambulance driver, a paramedic. He said to my friend Margaret, "I've come to fetch you. I'm standing on the other side." And Margaret says, "I can't move. I'm pinned. Take her. She's going to die." And I'll never forget the words that paramedic said. He said, "I can't. This ambulance is for whites only." And an hour later, another ambulance came with no life support system and took my sister to the hospital. She died on the way to the hospital. And you know, when I stood there and I got the news, I said to myself, you know what? This system has just killed my sister. This system has killed my best friend. She was my best friend. We grew up together. And at that moment, if you had put a grenade in my hand or an AK-47, all you needed to do is to tell me in which direction I must shoot. And so for me, the biggest struggle, I left a few years later. I just could not come to terms with that. And I left to get reoriented. I stayed away 10 years. But this big struggle I had during those 10 years is, how do you forgive a system? You know, I can forgive a person, but how do you forgive a system? And I could not find an answer 10 years. But 10 years later, I sat in front of my television in upstate New York. And I see Nelson Mandela walking out of prison. And Nelson Mandela says to the world and to me, in a sense, although the system has done all this to me, I've forgiven the system. And I said to myself, if he can do it as my leader, I can try. So I packed up everything and I came back. And I wanted to be part of this reconstruction, building a new country, building a new South Africa, making a small contribution towards that. And in my field in particular, 1990 when I came back, I worked in education. And one of the documents that I first studied started my journey into Ubuntu in a formal way. And I quote, it comes from our white paper on education, but it is based on the country's interim constitution of 1993. And I quote, it says, this constitution provides a historic bridge between the past of a deeply divided society, characterized by strife and conflict and untold suffering and injustice, and the future founded on the recognition of human rights, democracy, and peaceful coexistence and development opportunities for all South Africans, irrespective of color, of race, of class, of belief, and sex. The pursuit of national unity and the well-being of all South African citizens and peace require reconciliation between the people of South Africa and the reconstruction of society. And this is the part that I like. The adoption of this constitution lays the secure foundation for the people of South Africa to transcend the divisions and strife of the past, which generated gross violations of human rights. The transgression of humanitarian principles in violent conflicts and a legacy of hatred and fear and guilt and revenge. These can now be addressed on the basis that there is a need for understanding, but not for vengeance. A need for reparation, but not for retaliation. A need for Ubuntu, but not for victimization. So that's the first time in an official document that I pick up this word. And two issues grabbed my attention within the context of Ubuntu. One was the concept of common humanity, and the other is the idea of a common future. Nelson Mandela made me realize that a sense of community is absolutely essential, particularly in a society such as ours in South Africa, where we grew up on a steady diet of myths and unquestioned assumptions about each other, where we've long assumed that the divisions between groups of people based on race, on origin, on language, occupation, gender, religion, and nationality and orientation are more real and more enduring than our common humanity. There is a book here that I've got, and I'm going to leave this book with Rui, my friend. It's called Let Africa Lead. It's by Ruel Khoza, and Nelson Mandela wrote the foreword in this book. And the first chapter of this book is about the philosophy of Ubuntu. It's a very nice book. I give it to you when I'm done. But I want to say that in this book, he says, all big ideas are simple. Now, when you talk that language, I like that. All big ideas are simple. Ubuntu, this is the first time I hear Mandela speaks about Ubuntu. He says Ubuntu is a simple big idea. It asserts that the common ground of our humanity is greater and more enduring than the differences that divide us. It is so, and it must be so, because we share the same fateful human condition. We are creatures of blood and bone, of idealism and suffering. And though we differ across cultures and faiths, and though history has divided us, rich from poor, free from unfree, powerful from powerless, and race from race, we are still branches on the same tree of humanity. End of quote, Nelson Mandela. But I want you to notice the language of universalism or non-particularism in the words of Nelson Mandela. And so the Ubuntu Global Network, and that is my appeal to the Ubuntu Global Network, should always encourage a global perspective, celebrating what is distinctly human in all cultures, and help us to recognize that group rivalries and unhealthy national competition can lead in this age only to total destruction. It is through diversity that we express our ultimate unity. And in our work, differences should be looked for, not run away from. They should be attended to and celebrated as good news and as opportunities for learning. What about this idea of a common future? Again, in the same document, it says, when all South Africans won equal citizenship, their past was not erased. The reason why I could tell you this story is that my past was not erased. The complex legacies, good as well as bad, live on in the present. Difficult as it may be to do so, South Africans need to understand each other's history, each other's culture, values, and aspirations, not turn away from them if we are to make the best of our common future. So, one of the philosophical underpinnings of Ubuntu is that we are not in the world simply to adapt to the world. Trees adapt to the world. Human beings don't adapt to the world. We act on the world, something a tree cannot possibly do in the same way. And we change that world. There is no ready-made world into which we are born. We can participate in creating a new world and give meaning to it, to this new world. And I believe it's a very sad thing indeed when we lose our sense of humanity and neglect our God-given capacity to make a difference in this world. So this perspective of a common future is based on a worldview that sees the environment, the earth, and all life upon it, including all human life, as essentially sacred. And this reverence for life and the reverence for life, both human and in the environment, will help us as global citizens to become kinder and gentler, and will help us to seek to understand the natural world with a sense of awe and a sense of reverence, not to dominate or control that world. We will come to see what success really is. What is success? And I think for me, I always ask myself that question. What do I mean by success? We will come to see success and achievement and value It's not measured only by objective and tangible and quantifiable standards, such as test results and access to higher education and wealth and possession and prestige, but that it is also includes supreme values of life, such as beauty and joy and love and compassion and personal wholeness. These cannot be measured by any quantifiable standard or statistic, but must be honored nonetheless. Finally, I want to just speak about the concept of Ubuntu and identity and action. Ubuntu as action and Ubuntu as identity bring into relief the philosophical underpinnings of non-fragmentation. Don't take things apart. You keep things together. You keep people together. You keep ideas together. And I don't have time to expand on that, but that concept of wholeness, of non-fragmentation, is a means to understand African philosophy. The word Ubuntu can be seen according to a very interesting paper that I read by Ramosi called African Philosophy of Ubuntu. He says Ubuntu is actually a hyphenated word. If you look at the word, two words, he says Ubu and Ntu. And you heard the ambassador speaks about Batu, still N-T-H-O. It's just a variation of Ntu. It's a word that means person, Ntu. And the word Ubu means coming to be. You are becoming. So there are two words that are actually one. Two concepts that are indivisible. And we must not break that wholeness. Don't fragment the fact that you're a person and that you're becoming at the same time. I think that is a very important philosophical underpinning. So while on the one hand Ubuntu sees personhood of self as the ontological dimension, interdependence embeds a formation of individual identity within the shared community experience. I just want to point out that there is a distinction between Ubuntu and absolute collectivism. I do not believe in collectivism. While Ubuntu as an orientation to life is opposed to individualism and insensitive competitiveness, it is not suggesting that social must depersonalize the individual. That is not what Ubuntu is saying. It brings into relief two extremes in identity and a compromise that I'd like to mention. One is the view. You can say to yourself on the one hand, me, I'm so separated from everybody and all others that my self-expression is entirely unrelated to the consequences for others. I don't care. So I'm here in this world for myself. So that's one extreme. And this is almost an anarchistic approach, but it leads to what I call perverted self-interest and could lead to all kinds of crime and corruption. On the other extreme is the view that I am a member of a group and I just simply cannot decide on my own on action outside of this collective will. I'm so tied up with this group. I do not easily differentiate myself from others, and the preservation and care for the group is so paramount and, if necessary, overrides my own self-interest. I can critique that again by saying this view leaves little room for self-reflection and being critical of your own actions. There's a fusion, a compromise that says I have a distinct role, and I believe, in my view, this is closer to what Ubuntu intends. I have a distinct role to play in acting locally while thinking globally. My role needs to be aligned with the roles that others play. I must seek excellence as a part of a whole and have to define a pattern for the whole in which I have an exclusive and a unique identity. I do not lose my identity. I am who I am still, but I play this out in a role. And therefore that turns now to the last issue that I want to raise, and that's of action. Ubuntu sees a doer and the doing as one. You can't separate the doer from the doing, as you cannot separate the person from the becoming. Just as there is a false dichotomy between being and becoming, so the Ubuntu brings together doer engaged in the activity of doing. So Ubuntu helps us to understand that the basic moral reason for action is that action should always be for the greater good, and is seen as desirable if it helps to develop community, and it reduces discord, and it produces harmony. Ubuntu acknowledges individuality, yes, not in the service of self, however, but in the service of others and in community. In conclusion, is Ubuntu a philosophy? Is it a philosophy of life? Is it a worldview? Is it a social ethic? All these terms can be used to elucidate the nature of Ubuntu. Ubuntu can be likened to the concept of a value or that of a shared value, a cultural value. And cultural values represent the implicity or explicitly shared abstract ideas about what is good, what is right, what is desirable. Those are shared cultural values. And it thus serves to guide the actions of individuals and collectives within a specific goal. But Ubuntu is not a solitary cultural value, it's not one value, but rather a complex moral code or a system which encompasses a multiplicity of interrelated values. So Ubuntu can be described as a value system whose component values includes compassion, includes respect, human dignity, humanistic orientation, and collective will. And so, as I close, it may be fitting to end with the words of Nelson Mandela. And I quote again from The Long Walk to Freedom. It was during these long and lonely years in prison that my hunger for the freedom of my own people became a hunger for the freedom of all people. I knew, as well as I knew anything, that the oppressor must be liberated just as surely as the oppressed. A man who takes away another man's freedom is a prisoner of hatred. He is locked behind the bars of prejudice and narrow-mindedness. I am not truly free if I'm taking away someone else's freedom, just as surely as I'm not truly free if my freedom is taken from me. For to be free, says Nelson Mandela, is not merely to cast off chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. And Martin Luther King Jr. just says in the closing refrain, it's love that corrects that which revolts against love. It's always love that corrects that which revolts against love. Thank you very much.